is Arts Alive. I'm Lynda Philippi. My guest today is Karen Huntsberger. Karen has written a really amazing book called Waiting for Peace, and it is an account, much of it in her father's own words, of his experiences during World War II. And she is here to tell us the story of how this book came to be. So welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it's really an incredible book. Why don't you give us a little bit of the backstory about how you came to write it?
How I came to write it was finding a bunch of letters that had been sent to and from my dad when I cleaned out my mother's house in 2009. She died in 2008. He died in 1991, and I knew that he had kept a war journal, and my mother had typed it up in 1995. And only about a month before she died had I seen the journal and read it, and I was so fascinated. It was so compelling. And after she died, of course, it was quite a long time before I actually looked at the letters, maybe over a year before I looked at them. And it was summer like now, and I thought, oh, I'll start looking at those. Well, I couldn't stop. I remember even standing up in the hallway reading them late at night because I just wanted to know what happened next. Mm-hmm. And through this process of combining them, I ended up putting the letters chronologically with his journal so we could see what he was doing in the war and what he was writing home, which was different than what he was keeping track of. Mm-hmm. Because of censorship, they couldn't say a lot of things. And then also what they were saying from home and writing to him. And so I went through and was very selective about what I ended up using. And it shrunk up quite a bit from what it originally was, and it's still very large.
Oh, I'm sure it could be big.
Yeah, and I didn't use all the letters. There were lots of letters from friends, and he calls his girlfriends, the high school friends that wrote to him. But mostly it's his parents and siblings writing to him. And of the 6 kids in his family, 4 of them served during the war. 3 of them in active combat, 2 in the Navy in the South Pacific, Dad in the European theater, and then Lucy was a wave. Aunt Lucy, yeah. Who's so adorable in the book. And then Aunt Virginia was in college at the time, and she ended up in the Nurse Corps. She mm-hmm. wanted to be serving in the war, but the war was over before mm-hmm. she got out of college. But she still did go to the Nurse Corps and became a nurse. And
so through all of this, I'm sure that you came to view, Dad and Aunt Lucy and the uncles and even Grandma in a whole new light.
Absolutely, in a different light. Yeah. Of learning, knowing my 22-year-old dad, and also realizing that anything in my life is never going to be as hard as what he did as a combat medic. And my grandmother, I always knew her as a strong person. I didn't realize how really strong she was. She was not kind of a cuddly grandma. Dad always said she had a book in her hand and stirring a pot with the other hand. She was a reader. She's graduated from college during World War I, which was a huge achievement for a woman.
Unheard of, really.
Really unheard of, and she was a journalist at the college newspaper, Indiana University. Mm-hmm. So meeting all these people as young people, I only knew them as, my aunts and uncles and my grandparents. Mm-hmm. and
middle-aged people by the time you really
Yeah, middle-aged people. And grandmas then were so much older than grandmas seem now.
Believe me, honey, I completely agree with you.
The grandma glasses, the grandma shoes.
The bun.
Yeah. The bun. So,
the dress.
And they looked, 80 when they were 50.
Right.
So, but yeah, I got to know everybody. And then I had a couple of people in the book. Buster Crockett is featured a lot. He just passed away this last October. Mm-hmm. He was a huge source for me. And then Edgar DeGene is still living, is one of the other guys that was a friend of Dad, mm-hmm. who helped me quite a bit with just, verbal history over the phone.
From Indiana?
They all went to school together, high school. Mm-hmm. They grew up in the same little town.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then, when you had all this, you, at some point, obviously decided to put it into a book.
Yes.
And then the research began, right?
The research began because there were a lot of things I didn't understand, military terms, so I was forever looking up something on the internet. I had a military acronym webpage open all the time.
SAG and
yes, like
CRB
what are these 3-letter terms? I had to look them up. A lot of things I looked up I found to be, pretty appalling. I learned about Hitler's plan to further the Aryan race by the Liebesborn, the Fountain of Youth, and lots of children were born as a result of this program, and there's a big footnote in the book about that. But when I learned about that, it was just something I'd never known. And then the other research, when they're in the big part of the war, like in March and April of 1945, Dad doesn't write because he can't. He doesn't even change clothes for a month. He says at the end they had to burn all the clothing because it was so disgusting. There was no point in washing it. But there was just huge gaps, and so that's when I decided that I needed to find out if there was information in the National Archives. So I hired a researcher in St. Louis who went and got morning reports, and they are on the company level, their daily activity of men in and out, who was wounded, who was killed, and where they were. So I got those, and it still wasn't enough. I still didn't know what had happened. And a part of me was going, okay, maybe there's just no more information. But then the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, has all the unit histories, and which are, again, a day-to-day listing of what they actually did, sometimes hour by hour, every 15 minutes. So another researcher acquired those for me, and that's when things started to get filled in, that even though he wasn't saying what was happening, and historically we know what was happening in the war, we don't know what his very company was doing.
Right.
And so to me, I put those in chronologically, the unit histories. I combined all those and condensed them and put in things that I thought were compelling in terms of what people were doing, how many towns they went through, and also German prisoners of war. I didn't want people to think the suffering was only the Americans who suffered. Obviously, the Europeans suffered horribly, horribly.
Oh, amazingly. Well, the war was in their backyard.
Yeah, and the civilians,
starters,
so many
right.
civilians affected, and a lot of times the medics ended up treating civilians also, or Dad delivered a baby,
Yeah.
delivered a cow once too. But I think that the medical people were really sought after because the life was completely disrupted.
I think that's true in every war. I mean, even
Yeah.
now, our guys are over there treating local civilians and delivering babies, and
Right.
that's just the way it works, right?
It's just the way it works.
Yeah.
And so it's just, to me, it just got more and more fascinating. Watched a lot of movies. I had to stop sometimes because I ended up having too many dreams. But trying to learn as much as I could. And when I was young, I didn't want to know about World War II. I thought it was too harsh.
Well, and sort of ancient history, too, to a kid,
To a kid, yeah. Of course, I studied in high school, but and then in the middle of this too, before I did the archival research, we went to Europe and retraced some of his footsteps, and then we went to the Lorraine American Cemetery, where 10,349 American soldiers are buried, which is extremely impacting. People talk about going to Normandy and to the cemetery there, but there are many, many American cemeteries all over the world.
Sure.
And 11 of the men that he basically watched die are buried there. And I felt like I knew them. Particularly one he writes vividly about on the same day that he was wounded. I stood in front of this man's grave for like an hour just thinking, wow. And they called him Pop because he was 37 years old. And he was old compared to the rest of them. But here I felt like I knew him and the other guys that had been Dad's friends. So that was really a hard thing to do. I'm so glad I did it. I would go again, and we want to go again and trace more footsteps.
Of course.
Yeah.
So you finally got this whole thing pulled together, really, and I mean, there's not a lot of your voice in it necessarily. Because really you're compiling a lot of information, but obviously, the skill that it took to decide what to put in and what to leave out, and how to condense those histories and maybe condense some of the letters and things like that. When it was all finished, did you just look at it and say, wow?
Well, I've looked at it and said, wow, a lot. But
Yeah.
I also, those decisions were over a 5-year period.
Yeah.
And I also, when I realized and made the decision I wanted it to be public, I debated that for a long time, whether it would just be for our family. But I felt the story was compelling. It was a pure and simple story about people behaving honorably and dutifully.
You know what? I mean, really seriously, this book. It's just a classic story. There are thousands of stories like this. Thousands of young men and women, obviously, who left America and Indiana and different places and went off and did their thing. And, you know, if they were lucky enough to survive whatever wounds they had or, you know, not have any and then come home and go on to live a whole life. And the story was never told. I mean, your dad didn't sit you down around the campfire every night and say, well, let me tell you about when I was, you know, when I was in Marseille. He didn't.
Yeah.
You didn't.
I never heard any of that.
And most of the people that I talk to who are, you know, our age, the dads didn't do that.
They didn't talk about
it's
it.
so incredible, the stories that just were not ever told. And so unless somebody like you comes along and you sort of delves in and really digs through the family memorabilia and things like that, the stories, they die with them.
They die with them, and I think a lot of, you know, so many veterans, there's so few veterans living now. I attended in May the local Band of Brothers and a 70th anniversary luncheon, and they were honoring 42 local World War II veterans. And I think 21 or 22 of them were there. But their stories are dying with them. And to me, when you talk about my voice not being in it, my voice was originally in it, in the footnotes. And then I decided to take it out. And my copy editor also helped me take out my voice because it doesn't need my voice. They say everything that needs to be said. And I do think the women's voices are extremely strong in it.
I agree.
My grandmother, my two aunts, they're talking about what it felt like to be a woman at that time period and worried about, you know, I hear 3 of them were at war, and they all came home. My dad was the only one that got wounded.
What a miracle. Talk about lucky.
That was, yeah. And some families lost all of their children.
Really true. So what's next for you with this book? What happens next?
What happens next is, I think I'm just at the beginning of what it's going to mean. I'm, you know, talking to various groups, and I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with it. I've gotten great feedback. People have felt like they walked in his footsteps, and which was what I was hoping, that people would feel what he felt, and what his mother felt, and what his sister felt, and what his dad's a very cryptic writer, but, you know.
It makes me think of Garrison Keillor in that little sketch. Here, Dwayne, talk to your father. Hello, son.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But that was, you know, a man of that time period, too.
Yeah.
But what's next with it? I don't know. I'd like to write a book about Aunt Lucy. I do have all of her letters. She was a WAVE, and that WAVE program was amazing.
I think that would be really fascinating.
Yeah.
A fun book to write, and one of those, you know, go girl power books.
Yeah, and she was just such an interesting young woman, and got to be in D.C. during that great time period. And so that's my next thought. I haven't gotten to it yet, but...
But obviously you like the writing process enough to think about doing it again.
Yeah, I do. And I keep telling my husband, well, I'm not a writer. And he goes like, right, you have a published book, you're not a writer.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who write, and who would love to be able to say, I have a published book. Karen, I really want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And it's a wonderful book. I really recommend it. You know, everybody rush out and read it because I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. It's
Thank
been
you.
a real pleasure being here.